and I want to first bring up the voice of Wanda Coleman, the great Watts poet, the best voice of Watts, who passed but was my good friend. And I just want to bring her up because she stood for what Watts was. People may not know I grew up in Watts. As a kid, I left when I was about 8 or 9 years old, but I returned in my early 20s. My oldest kids were born there. And I worked in industry there. And I have to say, my talk is really about not just the Black liberation struggle, which was at the heart of what Watts was, but also the class struggle. This was a working class community. And people need to know that because they don't understand. When you go outside of LA, people don't get what Watts was. Watts was a working class community. There was a lot of industry in LA. It was the largest, and I think still is, but it went down completely like other places, the largest manufacturing center of the country, which is why Black people came there, especially in the beginning of World War II, because the Liberty ships that were being built in the shipyards there made it the largest shipyards in the country, brought a lot of other industry. And then eventually the auto industry, because it became the auto capital of the world, not auto industry like Detroit, but I'm talking about cars. They got rid of all the subways, built all these freeways. So they had GM plants, they had Ford plants, they had rubber tire companies, they had everything you needed for the auto industry. And there was garment and there was canneries. I know because I lived there and worked there, and I watched all that industry. Why it's important to bring out the class nature for Watts is because I think people don't know, may not know, that Watts was actually a Black and brown community. It always was. It was large Mexicans had lived there with Black people, and they were working in the same low end of the industry. Um, this is important because when I grew up there, my neighbors were Mexican and Black. We were all neighbors. We understood each other. It wasn't a situation where there was a lot of animosity, as some people would think. A lot of Black families learned Spanish because Mexicans were there, and Mexicans picked up the urban Black culture as part of their culture. This is why people say, how come Mexicans like soul music so much and the oldies and all this stuff? Because they grew up among Black people. The the Black and brown communities in LA were generally together. Pasadena had a Black and brown community. Pacoima was Black and brown. The west side of San Bernardino was Black and brown. In other words, every major community that had Black people, there was Mexicans right there. So that's an important part of it because the Mexicans get kind of forgotten, but they were an important part. Now, during the Watts Rebellion, um, I don't have to tell you that there was so much discrimination, so much policing against, but it was Black and brown that they were going after. They were going after both. There was even after the Pachucos during the World War II, they brought in so many Mexicans that they created a special Chicano tank just for the Mexicans. They were arresting Pachucos and Mexicans even who weren't Pachucos, even though there was 360,000 of them that went to World War II and fought. They were still treating them as if they were less. And so the Mexicans overwhelmed the prison system. And then, of course, the number of Blacks were much more overwhelming because the number of Blacks overall in the state was not the same numbers. So the prison system ended up being majority Black and brown. Up to 80% of the prison system in California, which is the largest prison system, I think, in the country. I think maybe Texas now surpassed it. But it was close to 80% were Black and brown. This made a significant shift in politics in the prison system. And I mention all this because, again, in Watts, that's what we were. When the Watts Rebellion happened, the police did two things. One, of course, they went all out to attack the Black community, all out. National Guard, they killed 34 people. They, there was so much hurting in the communities. The police role and the National Guard played a terrible role in the destruction of the community, also the people rebellion. But the other side of it is they cordoned off the Mexican community. They actually cordoned it off so they would not participate. They say there was 35,000 people involved in the Watts Rebellion, but there were 70,000 that were in agreement with what was going on, but couldn't participate. Many of them were the Mexicans that they cordoned off. If you read the book Rivers of Blood, Years of Darkness, he points out that Robert Canat, the author, points out that the few Mexicans that got killed, I think there was 2 or 3 of them, were the ones trying to break through the barriers so they can participate in the Watts Rebellion. People didn't know that story. The other side of the story, though, is the white working class. The white working class were actually across the Alameda tracks. They were in communities called Southgate, Huntington Park, Linwood. They had a big, giant General Motors plant in Southgate, huge. They were in those communities. What they did with the white community is tell them, arm yourselves, the blacks are going to come kill you. So you can see what they were doing is dividing the class in the middle of a class battle. You understand what I'm saying? Keeping Mexicans out and keeping the white working class armed to be against the blacks that were supposed to be doing the terrible thing of rebellion. The nature of racism in California, it's hard for people to know, but it was as bad as you can imagine. Chicago has the same history. I know I lived in Chicago 15 years, and I know how that is. They had restrictive covenants where you could not buy any house you want. That's why Mexicans and blacks live together, because you can only live among blacks and Mexicans. You couldn't live in other parts. Restrictive covenants was supposedly outlawed in 1948, but then in 1963, 2 years before the Watts Rebellion, they overthrew that law and put out a racist law in which they could discriminate again. That was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But in the meantime, people were again pushed into the worst neighborhoods. And then the policing was done in such a way that they were just concentrated in the black and brown communities. I think this is an important part of the story because the Watts Rebellion affected me that way growing up there. It affected my community. I saw what was happening. It also helped revolutionize me. The Watts Rebellion was I was 11 years old. It was the single most impactful thing that I saw because it was my neighborhood. It was my people. And I was a young man and I could see what was going on. And then 2 years later, because now by then I had moved in the East Side, the East LA area, which was most all Mexican, even though there was pockets of black people there too. I took part in the 1968 East LA walkouts of students, the largest walkout of students in the history of the country for high school, middle school kids at the time. 2 years later, I took part in the Chicano moratorium against the Vietnam War, which was the largest protest of anti-war protests in a community of color at that time. 30,000 people were there. And that also got attacked and led to a major riot that 3 people were killed and millions of dollars of damage. Same thing was going on, but not at the same level. But I took part in those things because Watts always was in my heart and my blood. I took that. And so in my early 20s, when I became a revolutionary conscious, people know my story. I was on heroin for 7 years. I was homeless for 3 years. I was in our jail, juvenile hall. I was in 2 adult facilities. I left all that to become a revolutionary. The revolutionaries, the radicals that were working in my community gave me the consciousness, and I went back to Watts. I went back to Watts where I learned more. I met some major revolutionaries, including our good friend Willie Baptist and others. I met some major people that helped me understand things, that taught me things. So Watts became my school afterwards. By the way, after the rebellion, things got worse in Watts. It didn't get better. But people did also create things. They created a whole new housing projects. They created new ways of interaction. They created youth centers. They created a lot of things. And so Watts is always going to be in my heart, even though I don't live in Watts now. I'm there all the time. There is now a big a mural across from the Watts train station, where one of the wall features the Mexican end of the story, and they have my poem, parts of my poem, Watts Bleeds, in there, to again commemorate that Watts, black and brown, rebellious, revolutionary, working class, took on the system the best it could and paid a big price, but it has become a beacon for all of us who want liberation and change. So I want to just express that that we were part of all that. I do want to say one last thing is that as far as I'm concerned, the now, as you know, LA is under attack with ICE raids. They're hitting these communities, mostly Mexican, Central American. They're really hitting them hard. Working class people. They're not going after gangsters. They're going after hardworking people. They are part of our community. They're part of the Watts community, part of East LA, part of the Northeast Valley where I'm at now. they are integral to our community. They're devastating our community by keeping them from working, arresting many of them as possible. Many of them are self-reporting, many of them are hiding. We have to do door-by-door checks on people's houses because they're not going to grocery stores. So we try to do teams to bring them food. And I will say the Black community has stepped up like they always have for the Mexican Central America. They're there as part of the protest. They're there to take part. They're not seeing this as well. That's their battle. I'm sure there's people doing that, but for the most part, they're not seeing this is their battle. I don't have to do with it. They know we're in the same battle. We're the same class. We're fighting the same struggle. And us uplifting the Black community is endemic to all of the class, as well as us fighting as a class. So I just want to put that out there, and that's what Watts represents to me. It's in my heart, and that's why I carry it. And even though I live all over the place, I will always have Watts inside of me. It's my home. Thank you.